You are kneeling on the cold stone floor of the Escorial Palace, the air thick with the scent of incense, beeswax, and fear. Your knees ache, but you dare not move. You are a lady-in-waiting, a whisper in the gilded halls of Habsburg, Spain, and before you, on a cavernous bed, shrouded in damask and shadow, the Queen is in labor. This is not a scene of joyful anticipation. It is a state emergency, a theological crisis unfolding in sweat and blood. The king, your master, paces in an antechamber, his long, sallow face a mask of pathological anxiety. He is not merely waiting for a child, he is waiting for a verdict from God. For generations, his family has performed a sacred and terrible alchemy, turning their own blood back upon itself. They have married nieces to uncles, first cousins to first cousins, all to protect the divine fluid that flows in their veins from the taint of the common world. It is a policy born of arrogance, a theology of power, a biological pact with disaster. They call it preserving the bloodline. You, watching the Queen's tormented face, have seen what it truly preserves: weakness, sickness, and sorrow. You have seen the ghosts of the children who did not survive their first year, their tiny, exquisitely dressed bodies laid in state, their misshapen heads and frail limbs a silent testament to this royal obsession. Every person in this room, from the grim-faced physicians with their useless potions to the priests murmuring prayers against witchcraft, is complicit in this slow, dynastic suicide. The true monster isn't a demon lurking in the shadows, it's an idea. An idea so powerful it has convinced the most powerful family on earth to methodically destroy itself in the name of purity. And as a piercing cry finally cuts through the suffocating tension, every heart stops. Is it the cry of a healthy heir, a savior for the empire? Or is it the thin, weak wail of another victim, another sacrifice on the altar of royal blood? You hold your breath, praying. But you know, deep in your soul, that in this court, miracles are in short supply, and the verdict of the blood has already been rendered generations ago. This scene, though imagined, captures the suffocating reality of a system where dogma had conquered biology, where political theory had become a medical death sentence. We are taught to see history's royal families through a lens of power, opulence, and romance. But beneath the silks and jewels of one of Europe's most dominant dynasties, the Habsburgs, lay a hidden and grotesque truth. They were in the grip of a bizarre and unshakable belief that their right to rule was encoded in their very blood, a substance so sacred it could not be diluted. This belief, a fusion of religious mysticism and political pragmatism, compelled them to practice generations of systematic inbreeding on a scale rarely seen in human history. They were not merely keeping it in the family, they were collapsing the family tree into a single, diseased trunk. The consequences were catastrophic, turning their palaces into laboratories of genetic decay and their children into tragic figures of suffering. This is the story of how a single, powerful idea, the sanctity of blood, became a biological poison, creating rulers who were not just figuratively, but in some cases, literally, monstrous. It is a forgotten chapter of history that reveals how the pursuit of purity, in any form, often leads to its terrifying opposite: corruption, decay, and collapse. The story of the Habsburgs is more than a tale of a doomed family. It is a profound and disturbing cautionary tale about the collision between ideology and the unyielding laws of nature. If you find value in exploring the hidden, often uncomfortable truths that lie buried beneath the surface of our accepted history, consider taking a moment to support this channel by hitting that like button and subscribing for more journeys into the forgotten corners of the past. It is a small act that makes a huge difference. And to create a sense of our global community of history lovers, please leave a comment below letting us all know where you're listening from in the world. It is a modern marvel that technology allows us to gather from every continent to dissect the follies and triumphs of those who came before us, and in doing so, perhaps better understand ourselves. To comprehend the tragedy of the Habsburgs, one must first dismantle the system of belief that held them captive. It was not simple arrogance or a casual preference for familiar partners. It was a deeply ingrained, multi-layered ideology fortified by God, law, and a flawed understanding of science. At its core was the political and theological doctrine of the divine right of kings. This wasn't just a claim to power, it was a statement about the very nature of the monarch. The king was not merely a ruler, he was God's chosen representative on earth. His blood was therefore not like that of other mortals. It was imbued with a spark of the divine, a sacred essence that conferred legitimacy, authority, and the right to rule. To mix this hallowed blood with that of a lesser noble, let alone a commoner, was seen as a form of contamination, a spiritual dilution that could anger God and destabilize the realm. This belief transformed marriage from a personal union into a sacrament of state, a critical act of dynastic preservation. The ideal spouse was not one who brought love or vitality, but one who brought more of the same sacred blood, reinforcing its concentration and, theoretically, its power. The family became a closed loop, a holy vessel that had to be protected from any outside influence. This theological imperative was rigidly encoded into law. Dynastic succession was not a matter of choice but of ironclad legal precedent. The crown had to pass through the legitimate, divinely sanctioned bloodline. To secure alliances and consolidate territories without diluting the blood, the Habsburgs turned to the only available pool of candidates, themselves. The practice of consanguineous marriage, marrying a close relative, became not just a preference, but a state policy. Uncles married nieces, first cousins married first cousins, creating a web of kinship so dense and tangled that it baffled genealogists and, ultimately, devastated their gene pool. Of course, such unions were explicitly forbidden by the canon law of the Catholic Church, but the Habsburgs were the staunchest defenders of Catholicism in Europe, the bulwark against the Protestant Reformation. This immense political and military power gave them leverage over the papacy. They repeatedly sought and were granted papal dispensations, special permissions that waived the Church's own rules against incest. Each dispensation was a triumph of political power over religious doctrine, another brick in the wall of their genetic prison. The Pope, often needing Habsburg military or financial support, would grant the waiver, effectively giving God's blessing to a practice that defied natural and, ostensibly, divine law. This created a perverse feedback loop. The Habsburgs' power allowed them to break the rules, and breaking the rules, they believed, was necessary to maintain their power. The law, both secular and religious, was bent to serve the central, overriding dogma of the blood. The final pillar of this tragic system was the primitive state of medical science. In an age before Gregor Mendel and the discovery of genetics, heredity was a mysterious and often terrifying concept. It was understood through vague, pre-scientific notions of blood and humor. Traits, both good and bad, were believed to be passed directly through the blood of the parents. When Habsburg children were born with the telltale signs of what we now know as extreme inbreeding, the protruding lower jaw known as the Habsburg jaw, a large tongue, epilepsy, intellectual disabilities, and crippling frailties, it was not seen as a predictable biological outcome. Instead, it was interpreted through the lens of their worldview. To some, these physical deformities were a family trait, a noble, if unfortunate, marker of their unique lineage, much like a coat of arms. To others, particularly when a child was severely disabled or died young, it was seen as a sign of divine displeasure, a punishment for some unknown sin, or worse, the result of witchcraft or a curse. This lack of scientific understanding fueled a deep-seated paranoia within the court. Instead of recognizing their marriage practices as the source of the problem, they looked for external enemies and spiritual failings. Physicians were helpless, offering prayers, bleedings, and bizarre concoctions. Exorcists were called in to drive out the demons believed to be tormenting a sickly royal infant. The very real, physical consequences of their choices were misdiagnosed as a spiritual malady, reinforcing the need for more piety, more insularity, and more of the same disastrous behavior. They were trapped in a cycle of cause and effect they could not comprehend, interpreting the evidence of their genetic decay as proof that their sacred mission was under attack. This bizarre medical belief, This inability to see the plain truth of their situation was what turned their quest for purity into a slow, inexorable march toward ruin. The epicenter of this dynastic decay was Habsburg Spain, a global empire on whose territories the sun never set, ruled by a family that was slowly collapsing from within. The process began not in a torture chamber but in a gilded carriage, carrying a young princess to her fate. Consider the journey of Mariana of Austria. In 1649, at the age of 14, she was sent from Vienna to Madrid to marry her own uncle, King Philip IV of Spain. He was 30 years her senior, her mother's brother, and a man already haunted by grief and the pressures of his crown. Mariana was not chosen for love or compatibility. She was a political pawn, a vessel for pure Habsburg blood, selected to produce the all-important male heir that Philip's first wife had failed to provide. Her journey across Europe was a slow, ceremonial indoctrination. She was stripped of her Austrian attendants, her clothes, her language, and her identity, all to be remade into a Spanish queen. Upon her arrival, she entered the suffocating world of the Alcázar of Madrid, a palace governed by a rigid code of etiquette so extreme it bordered on the absurd. Known as the Burgundian ceremony, this code dictated every moment of her life. She was not a person but an icon, a living symbol of the monarchy. It was said that the Queen of Spain had no legs. She was forbidden from being seen to walk like a normal human, often being carried or moving behind screens. She could not be touched by a man other than the king, and even an accidental brush in a corridor could have dire consequences for the unfortunate courtier. This life was a gilded cage of the highest order, designed to isolate her from the world and reinforce her semi-divine, untouchable status. Her primary, and indeed only, purpose was to conceive. The daily life within this royal prison was a strange and somber mix of extreme opulence and pathological piety. The court of Philip IV was one of the most brilliant in Europe, a patron of artists like Velázquez, yet it was pervaded by a sense of melancholy and religious dread. Philip, a man of appetites who fathered dozens of illegitimate children, was simultaneously racked with guilt and a belief that his personal sins were being visited upon his kingdom and his family. He spent hours in prayer, engaged in public acts of penance, and wrote despairing letters about his own unworthiness. For Queen Mariana, life was a cycle of pregnancy and loss. She endured multiple miscarriages and stillbirths. Each pregnancy was a national event, monitored with frantic hope and prayer. The court physicians, armed with their useless and often harmful remedies, would attend her constantly. When a child was born alive, the relief was quickly tempered by a terrifying vigilance. Was the baby healthy? Did it have the dreaded facial deformities? Would it survive the perilous first few months of life? The nursery of the Spanish Habsburgs was a place of deep sorrow. Of Mariana's 5 children with Philip IV, only 2 would survive to adulthood. One was the Infanta Margarita Teresa, the luminous little girl immortalized in Velázquez's masterpiece, Las Meninas, who would herself be married off to her uncle, the Holy Roman Emperor, and die at the age of 21 after a series of miscarriages. The other was the last hope of the dynasty, a boy named Charles. The psychological toll of this existence was immense. For the kings, it bred a specific kind of monstrousness, not always of active cruelty, but of a profound and paranoid detachment from humanity. Philip IV, trapped between his own failings and his divine mandate, sank into a deep depression, his reign marked by military defeats and personal grief. For the queens, the burden was even more severe. They were foreigners in a suspicious court, valued only for their wombs, and blamed when those wombs produced sickly children or failed to produce them at all. They lived in a state of constant anxiety and profound loneliness, surrounded by ceremony but starved of genuine human connection. Competition and jealousy were rampant among the ladies-in-waiting and court factions who vied for favor and influence. The use of opiates like laudanum was not uncommon for aristocratic women seeking to soothe their nerves, a polite term for the deep psychological distress of their constrained lives. They were trapped in a system that celebrated their blood while systematically destroying their bodies and minds. The internalized abuse was profound. A queen might come to believe, as the king did, that her child's death was a punishment for her own spiritual inadequacy. She was taught to see her suffering not as the result of a flawed system, but as a personal failure to live up to the impossible ideal of the divine monarchy. The culmination of this entire system, the final, tragic product of a century of incestuous policy, was born on November 6, 1661. He was Charles II of Spain, and from the moment he drew his first breath, he was a living monument to his family's folly. He was the son of an uncle and a niece, but his genetic heritage was far more compromised than that. His grandmothers were also first cousins, and the intermarriages stretched back for generations. Modern scientific analysis of the Habsburg family tree has calculated his inbreeding coefficient to be 0.254, a figure higher than that of a child born to a brother and sister. In essence, genetically, Charles II was his own first cousin. The physical consequences were immediate and shocking, even to a court accustomed to genetic anomalies. His Habsburg jaw was so pronounced that his upper and lower teeth did not meet, making it nearly impossible for him to chew his food properly. His tongue was so large, he had difficulty speaking clearly and drooled constantly. He was famously late to walk, not taking his first steps until he was nearly 4, and was not weaned from a wet nurse until the age of 5 or 6, a delay attributed to his inability to process solid food. He was plagued by illnesses his entire life. Measles, chickenpox, rubella, and smallpox all hit him with unusual severity, and he suffered from constant digestive ailments and fevers. Intellectually, he was severely delayed. He was largely illiterate, and his education was a disaster. His tutors found him listless, apathetic, and incapable of grasping complex subjects. Yet, he was not an idiot. Those who knew him described a man of simple kindness, deeply pious, and acutely aware of his own inadequacies and the immense burden of his crown. He was known as El Hechizado, the Bewitched, because the court and the country could find no other explanation for his profound infirmities. He was not seen as the product of a disastrous marriage policy, but as the victim of a demonic curse. His life became a grotesque theater of attempted cures. The finest physicians in Europe were consulted, prescribing bizarre diets, useless tonics, and painful procedures. When medicine failed, the Church stepped in. His confessors subjected him to grueling exorcism rituals. They interrogated him, prayed over him, and commanded the demons they believed were inhabiting his frail body to depart. In one infamous episode, exorcists presented him with the consecrated host and commanded the demons to be silent before God. When the king remained mute, unable to respond clearly due to his physical deformities, they took it as a sign of demonic possession. He was made to visit the tombs of his ancestors, to touch their relics, in the desperate hope of a miraculous cure. In a particularly macabre event, the coffin of his great-grandfather, the Emperor Charles V, was opened so that Charles II could gaze upon the corpse, a desperate attempt to absorb some of his ancestors' faded glory and strength. Charles was married twice, both times for the same desperate reason, to produce an heir. His first wife was the French princess Marie-Louise d'Orléans. By all accounts, she was devoted to him, treating him with a tenderness he had rarely known, but the marriage was barren. After 10 years, Marie-Louise died, and the court whispered that she had been poisoned by Austrian factions who wanted to see the king married to one of their own. His second wife was Mariana of Neuburg, a German princess chosen for her family's legendary fertility. She quickly came to dominate the weak-willed king, but she too failed to conceive. It is now widely accepted that Charles II was impotent and sterile, suffering from what was likely Klinefelter syndrome or a similar genetic disorder, a direct result of his family's inbreeding. His inability to produce an heir was not just a personal tragedy, it was a geopolitical crisis of the first order. The Spanish Empire, though weakened, was still a vast and wealthy global power. As Charles stumbled through his 30s, frail and childless, The courts of Europe began to circle like vultures. The great question of the age was, who would inherit Spain? His death without a clear successor would shatter the balance of power and plunge the continent into a devastating war. The end of his service to the dynasty was not to be a quiet retirement, but a slow, public death that held the fate of millions in its grasp. He was the ultimate consequence, the final bill for generations of dynastic pride. The system had produced its own executioner, a king so broken he could not sustain the bloodline he was born to represent. In a system so monolithic and suffocating, resistance seems an impossible concept. How does one resist a theological doctrine, a legal framework, and a biological destiny? Yet, even within the gilded prison of the Habsburg court, agency was not entirely absent. The victims of this system, while trapped, were not always passive. Resistance took many forms, some subtle and desperate, others shockingly direct, and all of them met with the crushing force of a system fighting for its own survival. It was a battle fought not in open fields, but in sick rooms, confessionals, and the whispered intrigues of palace corridors. The price of defiance was steep, but the human spirit, even when corseted by ceremony and weakened by disease, persistently sought a way to push back against the bars of its cage. One of the most potent, yet perilous, forms of resistance came from the very people tasked with maintaining the royal body, the physicians. While many were either sycophants or prisoners of the era's medical ignorance, a few dissenting voices began to emerge. These were not public rebels, but doctors who, through careful observation, began to suspect the truth. They noted the pattern of sickly infants and miscarriages that followed consanguineous unions. They might have dared to discreetly suggest to a powerful courtier or a confessor that perhaps a bride from a more distant, more vigorous stock would be beneficial. This was a treacherous path. To suggest that the Habsburg blood was not perfect, that it could be improved by an outside source, was tantamount to heresy. It questioned the very foundation of the dynasty's legitimacy. A physician who made such a suggestion, or who presided over the death of a royal infant, could easily become a scapegoat. They could be accused of incompetence, or worse, of poisoning or witchcraft, their careers ruined and their lives endangered. This quiet medical dissent was a covert act of scientific reasoning, struggling to be born within a world of superstition. Another form of resistance was political. As it became terrifyingly clear that Charles II would die without an heir, the court in Madrid fractured into powerful factions. One faction, led by the Queen Mother, Mariana of Austria, pushed for a Bavarian prince, her great-grandson, to inherit. Another, led by the formidable Cardinal Portocarrero and the French ambassador, maneuvered to have Philip of Anjou, the grandson of the French King Louis XIV, named as the successor. This was not just political jockeying, it was a radical act of defiance against 2 centuries of Habsburg policy. It was an implicit admission that the dynasty had failed, that the bloodline had run its course, and that the only way to save Spain was to hand it over to its traditional rival, the House of Bourbon. The dying king himself became the battlefield. His weak will was pulled back and forth between the factions. His final act, the signing of a will naming the French prince as his heir, can be seen as the ultimate, tragic act of individual defiance against his own lineage, a recognition that his family's legacy had to be sacrificed for the good of his kingdom. Perhaps the most personal form of resistance was that of Charles II himself. Though often portrayed as a passive, witless figure, his life was a constant, desperate struggle against his own body and the fate it represented. His submission to the endless medical treatments and humiliating exorcisms was not just passivity, it was an active, if futile, quest for a cure. He was desperately trying to become the king his people needed, to overcome the bewitchment he believed afflicted him. This was a man at war with his own cells. When his first beloved wife, Marie-Louise, died, he was consumed by a grief so profound that he demanded her coffin be opened so he could look upon her face one last time. This macabre act, like his visit to his ancestor's tomb, speaks to a deep psychological torment, a man seeking solace and answers from the dead because the living offered none. His ultimate surrender in the succession crisis, choosing a French heir over a Habsburg one, was not the act of a puppet but of a king who, in his final moments, chose his country over his family. It was a tragic and ironic form of self-sacrifice. He destroyed the central tenet of his dynasty Habsburg rule in Spain in a final, desperate attempt to fulfill his duty as king. The retribution for this systemic failure was not meted out by executioners but by history itself. The system's response to its own biological decay was the War of the Spanish Succession, a brutal, continent-spanning conflict that lasted for over a decade and cost hundreds of thousands of lives. The pure blood of the Habsburgs did not bring peace or divine favor. It brought a baptism of fire that reshaped the map of Europe. The dynasty's obsession with preserving its power through blood purity led directly to a war that shattered that power forever. The retribution was absolute. The system did not just punish its dissenters, it annihilated itself. The decline of this lethal belief system was not a gradual evolution driven by enlightenment. It was a catastrophic collapse followed by a slow, painful reckoning. The death of Charles II on November 1, 1700, was the inflection point. His final will, naming the Bourbon Philip of Anjou as his successor, triggered the inevitable. The Austrian Habsburgs, refusing to accept the end of their family's dominion in Spain, contested the will, and Europe plunged into the War of the Spanish Succession. This conflict was the true turning point. It was a brutal, pragmatic war that demonstrated the ultimate failure of the dynasty's founding principle. The bloodline that was meant to ensure stability had instead guaranteed a continent-wide war. When the smoke cleared in 1714 with the Treaty of Utrecht, Philip V, a Bourbon, was firmly on the Spanish throne, and the era of Habsburg Spain was over. The cycle of intense, systematic inbreeding in the Spanish royal house was broken by force. The primary driver of this change was, therefore, undeniable biological and political failure. The system had simply ceased to function. Charles II was the endpoint, a human being so compromised by his genetic inheritance that he could not fulfill the one essential duty of any monarch: to produce an heir. His existence was a living refutation of the idea that pure blood equaled strength. The political reality he created forced the European powers to dismantle the very succession they had spent centuries respecting. In other royal houses, the change was slower and driven by the creeping influence of science. In the 19th century, the British royal family, under Queen Victoria, faced its own genetic curse: hemophilia. The royal disease, passed down from Victoria herself, spread through her descendants into the royal families of Spain, Germany, and, most tragically, Russia, where the Tsarevich Alexei's illness contributed to the downfall of the Romanovs. While the full science of genetics was still in its infancy, the pattern was becoming undeniable. The understanding of heredity was shifting from a mystical concept of blood to a more scientific observation of inherited traits. Physicians began to speak more openly about the dangers of marrying close kin. While dynastic marriages for political purposes continued, the obsession with marrying exclusively within a tiny, closed loop began to fade, replaced by a slightly more pragmatic approach that valued vigor and health alongside political expediency. Queen Victoria and Prince Albert, for example, made a conscious effort to marry their 9 children into various Protestant royal and noble houses across the continent, an attempt to build a network of influence, but also one that diversified the gene pool, even as it unknowingly spread the hemophilia gene. The legacy of this period is not just a collection of tragic stories, it is a testament to the slow, agonizing birth of a more rational worldview. The resistance offered by early physicians, once a whispered heresy, eventually evolved into the foundational principles of modern genetics. The political factions that maneuvered to replace the Habsburgs were part of a larger shift away from a purely dynastic view of the state towards one that considered national interest, however brutally defined. The suffering of figures like Charles II, once attributed to witchcraft, is now understood through a scientific lens, offering a stark lesson in cause and effect. We can look at the portraits painted by Velázquez, not just as masterpieces of art, but as clinical documents. We can see the progressive exaggeration of the Habsburg jaw from one generation to the next, a visible record of a family's self-inflicted decline. The system did not die gracefully. It exploded, taking an entire European order with it. But from its ashes, a new understanding began to grow, that no family, no matter how powerful or divinely chosen, is immune to the fundamental laws of biology. The ultimate lesson was that nature does not respect crowns, and reality is a far more powerful force than ideology. The gilded cage had been broken, not by reformers, but by its own internal contradictions. The story of the Spanish Habsburgs is a descent into a nightmare of their own making. It is a chronicle of profound and prolonged suffering, inflicted not by an external enemy, but by an internal idea. We see the faces of young queens sent to foreign lands as broodmares, living and dying in a cycle of hope and despair. We feel the suffocating weight of a courtly etiquette so rigid it denied basic humanity. And we witness the final, tragic product in Charles II, a king broken in body and mind before he ever sat on the throne, a living ghost haunted by the genetic sins of his fathers. He was not a monster in the way of a tyrant who chooses cruelty. He was a man made monstrous by the choices of others. A victim of a system that prioritized a theoretical purity over the health and happiness of its own children. His life was a testament to the fact that the most expensive prisons are not made of stone, but of belief. The core theme that echoes through this history is the terrifying, self-perpetuating nature of dogma. The Habsburgs clung to the belief in their sacred blood, even as it was visibly poisoning them. Each sickly child, each miscarriage, was not seen as evidence that the system was wrong, but as a test of faith, a reason to double down on piety and insularity. They became trapped in a pathological loop, where the consequences of their belief only served to reinforce the belief itself. It is a chilling reminder of how ideology can blind people to the most obvious truths, allowing them to rationalize immense suffering in the name of a higher cause. But alongside this grim theme is one of courage and endurance. The quiet defiance of a physician, the desperate political maneuvering of a courtier, the tragic dignity of a queen like Marie-Louise, and even the sad, lifelong struggle of Charles II himself, these are all sparks of human agency refusing to be completely extinguished by an oppressive system. They remind us that history is not just made by grand doctrines, but also by the personal pain and resilience of the individuals forced to live within them. The moral lesson of the Habsburg tragedy resonates powerfully in our modern world. It is a visceral, historical proof of the dangers of pursuing purity. Throughout history, the belief that one group's blood, race, or ideology is inherently superior has been a justification for untold atrocities and, as the Habsburgs show, for staggering acts of self-destruction. This story serves as a profound cautionary tale against the politics of exclusion and the fetishization of lineage. It teaches us that strength comes from diversity, resilience from openness, and wisdom from the humility to accept that our most cherished beliefs might be catastrophically wrong. The rights and freedoms we often take for granted, the right to marry for love, the application of science to medicine, the separation of church and state were won, in part, on the ashes of systems like this one. The suffering of a bewitched king in 17th-century Spain is a distant mirror in which we can see the vital importance of reason, empathy, and the courage to question the doctrines we inherit. We must remember these stories. We must remember Charles II, not to mock his infirmities, but to honor the depth of his suffering and to understand the forces that caused it. To forget him and the system that created him is to risk forgetting the lesson he so tragically embodies. His story is a warning, written in the language of genetic decay, that any system that places an abstract ideal above human well-being is destined for monstrosity and collapse. He is the ghost at the feast of power, a permanent reminder that no crown is heavy enough to silence the truths written in our very bones. In the end, the blood that was meant to sanctify a throne became the very poison that dissolved it. The Habsburgs sought to elevate themselves above the rest of humanity, to create a lineage as pure and unchanging as a diamond. But life is not a mineral, it is a river. By refusing to let their river flow into the great, messy ocean of humankind, they turned it into a stagnant pool. The ultimate irony is that in their desperate quest to be unlike any other family on Earth, they succeeded, but not in the way they intended. They became a singular example for all time of how the obsession with being divine can lead to a uniquely human form of hell. And so we are left with a lingering and deeply unsettling question. What beliefs do we hold today with the same unshakable conviction that will seem just as bizarre, just as tragic, and just as monstrous to the historians of the future?